period from 1885 through the start of World War I saw a flurry of activity throughout the industrialized world in the development of the infantry rifle. There were many competing designs, such as Mauser, Lee, Hotchkiss, Krag, Jorgensen, Lebel, Mannlicher, Viterli, Kropatschek, each with its own unique set of advantages and disadvantages. The adoption of any one particular design over another was as much caught up in questions of national pride as it was in superiority of design. Further, many of these designs went up dead-end streets as they were chambered for black powder cartridges, rimfire cartridges, had tubular magazines, or had some other problem. Some of these designs recovered from their problems and got back into the mainstream of development. Others never recovered and simply disappeared from the scene. Even worse, some of these weapons were adopted and issued by the nations involved before the design itself had reached its maximum potential. All of the designs we mentioned were basic variations of the turnbolt design, the idea for which came from the Mauser single-shot breech loader of 1871. By the start of World War I, almost all weapons that had been adopted were bolt action of one sort or another. They all used cartridges with smokeless powder and jacketed Spitzer bullets, and had some sort of integral magazine with charger loading. As a good generic representative of the bolt-action magazine rifle, we have picked the Pattern 17 Enfield. This rifle borrowed a little bit from the Lee, the Mauser, and a few other designs, and was to be, along with the new .276 Magnum cartridge, the British rifle for 1914. World War I put a stop to its issue. The tooling was transferred to the United States, and the rifle was made in .303 caliber for the British from 1915 until 1917, when we entered the war. The tooling was then converted to .30 caliber, and the rifle became general issue for U.S. forces in World War I. Most bolt actions were simple, yet robust. In order to operate, the firer grasped the bolt handle and lifted it, thereby unlocking the bolt. He then drew the handle to the rear, thereby extracting the cartridge in the chamber, and at the rear of bolt movement, ejecting the cartridge out of the weapon. If the rifle was empty, then the follower in the magazine would rise, blocking forward motion of the bolt and telling the shooter that he needed to reload the weapon. The shooter then took his magazine charger, normally a disposable stripper clip holding 5 rounds of ammunition, and placed it in a corresponding notch milled into the receiver bridge. He pressed all 5 rounds downward with his thumb and then discarded the stripper clip. Forward motion of the bolt would then pick up the top round in the magazine, driving it forward into the chamber. Downward motion of the bolt would then lock the weapon. Depending upon design, at some point during the lifting of the bolt handle or the forward motion of the bolt, the cocking piece and firing pin would be cocked and held by the sear. Upon pressing the trigger, the sear was depressed, and the firing pin released to go forward and fire the cartridge. The shooter then grasped the bolt handle, lifting it upward, and the cycle started all over again. All bolt-action magazine rifles had some sort of adjustable sights. The most common were like this Mauser, an open sight mounted on the barrel. Though it is ballistically a very good sight, it is actually difficult for the shooter to use. Of the various designs, the best was a peep or aperture sight mounted on the receiver bridge. This placed it close to the shooter's eye, had the longest sight radius, and was the easiest for the shooter to recover his sight picture after he took his face away from the stock in order to work the bolt. In the case of the P-17, this sight was adjustable to 1,600 yards. Normally, however, a shooter was only trained to estimate the range to the target and independently fire at targets to 1,000 yards. Anything over 1,000 yards was normally volley fire with the range and the firing commands given by the squad leader or the platoon commander. In some armies, marksmanship training was given little attention. In others, rifle marksmanship was considered to be the primary soldierly quality. The British are a good example of this. They had learned their lesson in the Boer War, and in the early 1900s, their emphasis on marksmanship made them one of the better armies in the world. The U.S. Army also placed great emphasis on individual rifle marksmanship, and numerous marksmanship exchange programs had been engaged in between U.S. and British rifle clubs since the 1870s, and on an official basis between the armies from the 1900s. In fact, the first Wimbledon Cup was a rifle marksmanship award between the two nations. In those nations that did emphasize individual rifle marksmanship, the sling was not simply a carrying strap, as you use today, but served double duty to help stabilize the weapon during firing. The sling on this P-17 is of such a type. The shooter got into it like this. The sling helps steady the rifle prior to and during discharge, help reduce the movement of the weapon during recoil, and help the shooter reacquire the sight picture. This latter can be quite important. The reacquiring of the sight picture after working the bolt frequently took more time than the working of the bolt itself. You can see the advantage of the sling. The British Army in particular conducted a great deal of training on the manipulation of the bolt and reacquisition of the sight picture. We'll show you a P-17 in action against pop-up targets at 3 ranges and against a 4th stationary target at 680 yards. As you watch this, you'll note the shooter make a major error and then correct himself partway through. See if you can spot it. Before we go to the chart and compare the bolt action, what error do you think you spotted? In fact, the error was that when the shooter finished engaging the targets at 330 yards, which was at the edge of his battle sight range, he should have adjusted the sights before engaging the target at 680 yards. He fired his first shot without this adjustment, and the round hit well short. After adjusting the sight, he hit close to the target, though to one side. The wind was very, very heavy on the day that he was firing, and that miss was caused by wind drift. Though not shown on the tape, By the fifth round, he was putting the shots right in there. On the chart, it looks like this. The superiority of the bolt action over the single-shot breech loaders, and we're using the 1873 Springfield as a generic example, is quite obvious. Though the battle sight range on this P-17 was 370 yards, this could vary from one rifle cartridge combination to another to between 320 and 370 yards. The maximum adjust sight range could be 100 or 200 yards less, again depending upon the rifle and cartridge combination. Also remember that 1,000 yards did not represent the maximum distance that the bullet would travel. Firing in volley, effective fire could be delivered at greater ranges. In fact, British rifles before World War I had sight adjustments to 2,600 yards, and they regularly conducted volley fire training out to 1,900 yards. For volume of fire, you can see that the bolt action has roughly double the volume of the single shot. The bolt action's primary advantages in volume of fire are its magazine charging with the stripper clip and the relatively small motions that have to be made in order to reload the rifle. This volume of fire for the bolt action on the chart assumes recovery of the sight picture and taking a few seconds per round to aim precisely at one of the longer range targets. At closer ranges, such as 150 yards or less, where precise sight picture was not all that important, recovery after recoil was much faster, and the volume of fire would frequently go up to 20 rounds per minute. The effect of this drastic increase in both volume of fire and combat range in just a few short years is almost legendary. The trench warfare of World War I was a direct outgrowth of the bolt-action rifle, the water-cooled machine gun, and the new breed of artillery. Though you'll study World War I in great detail, suffice it to say that airplanes, mechanization, radios, and a number of other things had not yet appeared. These would help redress the balance and make the offense equivalent in strength to the defense. Without these things, World War I became stagnant. The no man's land between the two lines was very appropriately named. Moving in the open in no man's land, facing an enemy armed with these bolt-action magazine rifles was risky business indeed. The idea of using the forces released upon discharge of a weapon in order to cycle that weapon dates from the 1880s. You have been exposed to some of the major designers, such as Maxim and Browning, and to one of the two basic systems, recoil operation. Using these ideas in the infantryman's rifle was either beyond design capability or entailed a heavier weapon than most nations were willing to tolerate. Consequently, on the eve of World War II, all nations but one were equipped with basically the same rifle they had used to fight World War I. Like this British Lee Enfield, or this German 98K, there was basically no change. They were bolt-action magazine rifles that were loaded using stripper clips. I said this was true in all nations but one. That one was the United States. Development of a semi-automatic rifle had been receiving attention in the United States since World War I. The Browning automatic rifle was originally intended as an individual's weapon. After the war, Colonel Thompson, the inventor of the Thompson submachine gun, also fielded a design for a semi-automatic rifle. His design was complicated, had a very long receiver, was not very robust, and not really satisfactory for an individual semi-automatic rifle. Pedersen, the designer of the Pedersen device of World War I fame, also designed a semi-automatic rifle. He used the toggle action very similar to the Luger pistol for his rifle. Though much closer to what the Army was looking for, the Pedersen was, for a number of reasons, also not satisfactory. John Garand, a designer at Springfield Armory, stepped into this arena in the early 1930s. By 1936, he had combined a few ideas of his own with some basic ideas from Pedersen and with the Browning gas operation system. The result was a rifle that, even though the Army designated it the M1, would forever be known as the Garand. The rifle used a gas operation system. Here's how it works. After the powder begins to burn, it generates gas at extremely high pressure and propels the bullet down the barrel. As the base of the bullet passes a gas port, a small amount of gas exits the port. This gas goes into a cylinder mounted underneath the barrel, where it further expands, pressing on a piston which rides in the cylinder. This piston is machined onto the end of the operating rod. The operating rod's other end has a cam follower slot cut in it, and this fits over a corresponding cam projection on the side of the bolt. The first fraction of an inch of movement of the operating rod allows for the time it takes for the bullet to exit the muzzle and gas pressure in the barrel to drop. The cam follower then strikes the cam at an angle, driving the cam up and unlocking the bolt. It then carries the bolt all the way to the rear, which extracts and ejects the old cartridge case. At this point, the energy in the operating rod has been spent in opening the bolt and compressing the operating rod spring. The spring now takes over, driving the bolt and the operating rod forward. The bolt picks up the next cartridge, feeds it into the chamber, and as the cam follower pushes the cam downwards, the bolt locks and the rifle is ready to fire again. This entire operation takes about 1/10 of a second. The Garand feeds from an 8-round en-bloc clip. It is descended from the Mannlicher en-bloc clip of the 1880s. In the Garand, the en-bloc clip is staggered double column, but still works exactly as Mannlicher intended. The rifle provides the magazine follower and follower spring, which pushes the cartridges upward so that the bolt can get to them. The en-bloc clip provides the feed lips, which hold the cartridges in alignment so that the bolt can push them into the chamber. After firing the last shot, the weapon begins to cycle normally. As the last cartridge is ejected, the magazine follower also ejects the now empty en-bloc clip. The follower rises to the limit of its travel, tripping a lever and locking the bolt to the rear. The soldier then takes his next 8-round en-bloc clip and presses it down into the rifle from above. When the clip locks into position, the bolt is released, chambering the first cartridge, and the rifle is now ready to fire again. This weapon obviously has some great advantages over a bolt-action rifle. Let's take a look at the Garand firing against a bolt-action. The Bolt will have 2 targets each at 80, 185, and 330 yards, while the Garand will have 3 targets each at those ranges. The winner of the race will fire on a stationary target at 680 yards. Perhaps that wasn't very suspenseful. On the chart, it looks like this. The combat range is exactly the same. This is because both the bolt action and the M1 Garand fire a full power rifle cartridge. The volume of fire for the Garand is quite obviously greater by more than a factor of 2. But the differences between the 2 rifles are a good bit more than what you see. It is the placing of the face and hand back on the stock, what some people call a stock weld, and reacquiring the sight picture that takes the time with the bolt action. In fact, it takes more time than the actual working of the bolt itself. The great advantage of the M1 Garand is that for the 2nd through the 8th shot, you do not have to do this. Reacquisition of the sight picture is extremely simple and fast. This is what gives the M1 Garand its higher volume of fire. Any fool can fan his finger inside the trigger guard and rip out 8 rounds in a couple of seconds. This is not effective fire. When we say 32 rounds a minute for the Garand, we mean a well-trained shooter using a sling to help stabilize the weapon in recoil and using a stable position, prone or sitting, and putting every bullet where he wants it to go. At the longer ranges, the M1 Garand is just as accurate as any bolt-action rifle. At first glance, the Garand's aperture sight does not appear to be adjustable for range. This is not true. The elevation knob on the Garand rear sight serves double duty as a ballistic range drum. After the weapon is zeroed for the individual shooter, the drum is loosened and re-indexed so that the battle sight arrow is pointing to the 0 mark. Whenever the shooter wants to fire beyond his battle sight range, he estimates the range to the target and turns the elevation knob until the range as printed on it is lined up beside the 0 mark. The sights are now adjusted for that range and the shooter can fire. The M1 Garand was certainly the best general-purpose battle rifle used in World War II. Given the scope of World War II, it is difficult to isolate an incident in which the Garand's superiority over a bolt action is clearly demonstrated. We originally intended that every rifleman be armed with an M1 Garand. This gave our squads a much higher volume of fire. After-action reports from numerous small unit leaders consistently cite this increased volume of fire as a major factor. There were, of course, some places where the M1 Garand probably should not have been issued and used. In this jungle, for example, a submachine gun might be better. In most areas, particularly in North Africa and throughout Europe, the Garand was just the ticket. It was, as General George S. Patton said, the greatest battle implement ever devised. An assault rifle is a selective fire individual weapon. When fired semi-automatic, it is intended to fill the role of the infantryman's battle rifle, and when fired on full automatic, it is intended to do better than the submachine gun. In order to make such a thing work, compromises are necessary. Most assault rifles are chambered for a class of cartridges which falls roughly midway between the pistol cartridges, such as the 9mm Parabellum, that are used in the submachine guns, and the full-powered rifle cartridges, such as the 8mm Mauser, caliber 30, and 7.62 NATO, which are used in rifles and machine guns. The basic idea got its start in the period 1936 to 38, when the Germans conducted experiments with scaled-down sporting rifle cartridges. Concepts for use of these cartridges proceeded slowly. By 1942, however, the Germans were confronted with virtual human wave attacks on the Eastern Front. Their shortage of manpower was such that frontages of 1,000 yards for a squad were not unusual. This means that an individual rifleman would have to cover a front of 80 to 100 yards, armed only with his bolt-action rifle. His nearest fire support would be the MG-34 in his squad, which might well be 500 or 600 yards away. These realities and other demands gave impetus to a German search for a greater volume of fire on the part of the individual soldier. To make a long story short, the Germans designed a selective fire individual weapon which was chambered for their reduced power cartridge from the 1930s. They named the weapon Sturmgewehr, literally translated assault rifle. The assault rifle was and is intended to give the individual soldier a selective fire capability. The hope is that when firing semi-automatic, he can fire as a rifleman, and when firing full automatic, he will at least outrange and otherwise do better than a submachine gun. Our purpose here is not to talk about the history of the assault rifle. You have watched a number of these weapons tapes and should have assimilated a historically based methodology for the evaluation of the strengths and weaknesses of any weapon and its employment in light of these strengths and weaknesses. Consequently, we will show 2 assault rifles and 1 main battle rifle and then leave you with some questions. The first weapon you will see is the AK-47. It is the preferred weapon of the Soviet bloc, and it is believed that something in excess of 40 million have been made. It is chambered for the 7.62 by 39 Russian short cartridge. This cartridge fires a 123 grain bullet at approximately 2,400 feet per second. In rough terms, This gives it approximately 60% of the energy and effect of the 7.62 NATO at the muzzle. Due to the lighter bullet's poor ballistic coefficient, the 7.62 by 39 Russian short suffers severe degradation due to air resistance. In exchange for all this, it is selective fire. The second rifle you will see is the U.S. M16A1. It is chambered for the 5.56 by 45 millimeter cartridge, firing a 55 grain bullet at 3120 feet per second. This gives it a bit less than 50% of the energy of the 7.62 NATO at the muzzle, and due to its extremely poor ballistic coefficient, this percentage decreases still further due to air resistance. It does have some greater effect than its numbers would indicate due to its muzzle velocity being over the threshold of 3,000 feet per second. However, since the ballistic coefficient is so poor and the velocity decays rapidly, this effect is all but gone by the time the bullet gets 80 or 90 yards downrange. In exchange for this, however, the recoil impulse from the 5.56 millimeter cartridge is less than that of the 7.62 NATO. The third weapon you will see is the M14 rifle, chambered for the 7.62 by 51 NATO cartridge. This cartridge fires a 150 grain bullet at 2750 feet per second. It is the equivalent of the full-powered rifle rounds which you have seen from the Boer War through World War II. The recoil from this cartridge is heavy enough so that full automatic fire from a 10-pound weapon is a virtual impossibility. Each of these weapons will engage the same targets in sequence. First will be 3 pop-up targets at 75 yards, followed by an area suppression target at 280. Then will come 2 pop-up targets at 330 yards, and for the M14 only, a single stationary target at 680 yards. Let's take a look. A couple of things are readily evident from the tape. First, the M14 rifle is certainly capable of delivering accurate and effective fire to ranges far beyond what the other two are capable of. At 680 yards, the M14 scored 11 hits out of 16 rounds. Secondly, though the AK-47 and the M16A1 can be fired full automatic, it would appear that there is difficulty in controlling the automatic fire. In all cases, the bursts of fire defined a fairly large beaten zone. A more stable position and a shooting sling, which neither weapon is equipped with, might help, but the beaten zone from full automatic bursts would still be very large. On the chart, the bolt action, Garand, and M14 all have roughly the same combat range. The AK-47 and M16A1 suffer a disadvantage here. I might add that the 400 yards for the M16 adjust sight range assumes a trained rifleman and a still day. The M16A1 does not have sights adjustable for range, and it requires Kentucky windage. Further, the ballistic coefficient of the bullet is so poor that given a crosswind, the M16 bullet blows severely and erratically, and a hit at 400 yards in a wind is quite an iffy thing. The volume of fire has obviously increased from the bolt action to the Garand to the 40 rounds per minute of the M14. With full automatic bursts, the AK-47 and M16A1 are up to 60 rounds per minute. The M14's only advantage over the Garand is its 20-round detachable box magazine, which reduces time lost from reloading the weapon, and its hook butt plate, which tends to keep the weapon stable on the shoulder. However, 40 rounds per minute certainly pushes what the trained rifleman can do. If the rifleman hit with every round and had to shift to a new target after every shot, he would not be able to get 40 rounds per minute. When firing suppression, 40 rounds per minute is feasible and limited only by heat buildup. We show both the M16A1 and AK-47 at 60 rounds per minute. For short periods of time, say 3 to 4 minutes, they can be fired on full automatic at much higher volumes of fire. However, this may not be controllable fire. Further, the AK-47 and M16 fire from the closed bolt and have relatively little mass in the barrel. They heat up badly, and this limits the sustained volume of fire. The follow-on weapon to the M16A1, the M16A2, will have roughly the same volume of fire, but an improved combat range due to its heavier bullet and faster twist. The Soviet follow-on weapon, the AK-74, will likewise have the same sustained volume, but will actually suffer a degradation in combat range due to the light 5.45 millimeter cartridge. With your new M16A2, you will have parity with the AK-47 or be slightly superior to the AK-74. There are basically two schools of thought concerning the assault rifle. One school is that the assault rifle is neither fish nor fowl. The cartridges for the assault rifle give up so much in power that they do not qualify for effective long-range rifle fire. On the other hand, they still have enough recoil so that the controlled, accurate bursts of the submachine gun are non-existent. The opposing school of thought holds that the assault rifle is the optimum blend of all weapons characteristics. The average rifleman cannot hit anything beyond 400 yards or will not be able to see anything beyond 400 yards, and therefore there is no reason to give him a rifle which will shoot beyond 400 yards. In exchange for this acknowledgement of reality, full automatic capability is more than worthwhile. What do you think? You have seen many weapons in these tapes. You have seen examples of leaders who tailored their organization and tactical plan to take advantage of the strengths of their weapons and shield themselves from the weaknesses. What are the strengths and weaknesses of an assault rifle? If the AK-47 and M16A2 have parity, and yet the enemy armed with the AK-47 outnumbers you greatly, under what conditions will you join battle? What will you do to give yourself the winning edge? Does the edge lie in training and morale? If so, does that tend to undercut the idea that the soldier will not be able to shoot past 400 yards? At one time, the U.S. Army could certainly do so. Perhaps the winning edge lies not within the rifle, but in the other weapons that are present, such as artillery or tanks or something else. If so, then what does the infantry do? If the M16A2 has parity with the AK-47 in both combat range and volume of fire, then any engagement within M16 range is by definition decisive. How much of a winning edge must you have to accept decisive engagement with a numerically superior enemy? When you ask that question, then ask yourself what Daniel Morgan, or Custer, or Edward III, or Robert E. Lee would have answered. The question is obviously quite complex and goes far beyond a consideration of the rifles alone. It must encompass not only weapons, but the training of the individual soldier and even the society from which he comes. The point is that throughout history, no weapon has ever done everything. Every weapon has a unique set of advantages and disadvantages. You must take advantage of the strengths and shield yourself from the weaknesses. There are adequate historical examples to guide you. Regardless of the results of your analysis concerning the assault rifle, I would urge you to carefully consider the questions. In watching these tapes, you have received a good background in the history of weapons, their characteristics, and their effect on the battlefield. Whatever you do, ensure that you have the winning edge. Battle is not conducted on Queensberry rules. Whenever lives are at stake, only a fool or a desperate man will fight on even odds. You must ensure that you have the winning edge. In the 21 years between the world wars, many nations devoted a great deal of effort to new machine gun designs. Their hope was to have a machine gun that would be more mobile than the water-cooled and yet give up as few of its advantages as possible. I do not want to cover the history of weapons development during those 21 years. Instead, I'll compare two designs, the MG-34 and the BAR. I'll cover the characteristics which resulted from their design and then show how each army incorporated that weapon into its tactical organization and doctrine. According to this chart, one would say that the MG-34, with its higher volume of fire, is obviously the superior weapon. Well, I'm not so sure. Let's take a look. This is the German MG-34. It weighs 26.5 pounds and can be carried by one man. It feeds from this metallic, non-disintegrating belt. This belt must be recovered by the crew and reloaded with ammunition after use. Unlike the Maxim and Browning cloth belts, these belts lay on top of the cartridges in the feedway. The bolt drives the cartridge forward, down, and out of the belt into the chamber. The weapon operates on the short recoil principle, but you have seen before. It does not have water cooling, so it employs two other things in order to dissipate the heat generated by sustained fire. First, it fires from the open bolt so that when the weapon is not actually firing, air can circulate through the barrel. Secondly, it has a quick change barrel. When a barrel becomes overheated, it need only be exchanged for a cool one. The MG-34 and BAR will make the same target run. When displacing between engagements, 3 surprise targets will appear at 50 yards. Some disadvantages of the MG-34 become immediately apparent. Though the weapon can be carried by one man, it is not single-man portable. That high volume of fire is predicated upon the quick-change barrel for dissipation of heat. There has to be an assistant gunner for carrying spare barrels in the spare parts kit. At the volume of fire shown on the chart, the crew has to change the barrel once every minute. Since it consumes more ammunition, an ammo bearer is needed. It takes a while for the crew to get the weapon into and out of position. You saw the confusion as the emergency targets were initially engaged by the assistant gunner with his rifle. He knew the machine gun simply couldn't open fire in time. Since our targets don't actually kill people, the crew then went ahead and engaged them with the MG-34. This weapon can be fired in an emergency, as you see in this photograph. I'm not so sure, however, that I would like to be the assistant gunner who carries it over my shoulder while the gunner behind me blazes away. The MG-34 was difficult to control. You should have noticed that it had a large beaten zone. The extremely high cyclic rate, over 800 rounds per minute, does not help this. Since it is a short recoil weapon, nearly 1/3 the weight of the weapon is moving after every shot, making it even more difficult to control and recoil. However, this is what the German wanted, for in the squad he saw the MG-34 as an area suppression weapon. Another disadvantage of its high cyclic rate is that the part velocity is higher. If the bolt has to travel backward and forward 800 times per minute rather than, say, 500 times per minute, then the bolt's acceleration and deceleration at the beginning of each forward and back motion is that much more violent and abrupt. This breaks parts and places a premium on clean, high-quality ammunition. Partway through engaging the first set of targets, the MG-34 extractor tore through a cartridge case. The crew had to change barrels in order to continue. Normally, one of the assistant gunners would have used the toolkit to clear that barrel. Otherwise, the barrels were changed only when overheated. Wherever possible, the Germans set up the machine gun on the tripod. This helped stabilize the weapon and gave it a smaller beaten zone. Further, its traversing and elevating mechanism aided in the adjustment of long-range fire. The tripod was a heavy, clumsy affair, but it was always carried with the machine gun. You do not see German combat photography of the MG-34 without a tripod or an observer with binoculars to assist in the adjustment of long-range fire. This is the proper way to employ a crew-served weapon. The gunner adjusts sights, aims, and fires the weapon, and the assistant gunner keeps it working. Somebody else must spot the fall of the rounds. Without this, the effective range of the machine gun is no more than 1,000 yards. Secondly, you will never see German soldiers carrying belts of machine gun ammunition festooned across their chests like the Frito Bandito. They always carried their ammunition in the can and fed it directly from the can into the machine gun. This kept the ammo clean and the belts free of rust and was essential for reliable operation. The MG-34 pays a price for its volume of fire. With its spare barrels and tripod, it weighs roughly 3/4 what a water-cooled machine gun weighed. It is slow to place in position. It still takes a 4-man crew to carry it and extract from it its potential volume of fire and combat range. To a German, none of this was a disadvantage. His tactical organization was based on this machine gun. This is the breakdown of the German squad. It is plain that the German squad was designed for fire and movement. The machine gun would lay down a base of fire. While it was suppressing the enemy, the remainder of the squad would maneuver about, and when the range was proper, they would go in with grenades, rifle fire, and the bayonet. This is the system that took Ibn Emal and Paris and got to the banks of the Volga River. The Browning automatic rifle of World War II was a beefed-up and bipod-equipped version of the BAR of World War I. The BAR weighs 18 pounds with its bipod and feeds from a 20-round, detachable, staggered, double-column box magazine. It does not have a quick-change barrel, though it does fire from the open bolt in order to help cool the weapon. It is equipped with a bipod to help stabilize the weapon during automatic fire from the prone position. The selector switch gave 2 different cyclic rates of fire, 500 rounds per minute and 350 rounds per minute, both of them fully automatic. Let's see what the BAR can do with the same target array that you saw before. It is quite obvious that the BAR does not have the sustained volume of fire of the MG-34. However, a couple of other things are equally obvious. The BAR can truly be carried and operated by one man. The weapon can be put in action as fast as any individual infantryman's rifle. It is certainly as accurate as the MG-34 when fired from the bipod. Its lower cyclic rate of fire and a few other characteristics reduce movement of the weapon during firing, and the beaten zone is relatively small. On a suppression target, the BAR was slightly less capable. A well-trained gunner could still put rounds in the target area and still kill or suppress the individuals there. However, he only had 20 rounds to do the job, and there was a distinct break in firing for changing magazines. Because it is a fixed barrel weapon, the volume of fire must be voluntarily held down. The weapon can be fired at more than 80 rounds per minute, but if it is, the barrel will rapidly overheat. Severe overheating burns out the barrel and may even warp the receiver. All of these disadvantages made little difference. The American squad was not primarily organized around the BAR. It was in the squad in order to beef up the squad's overall volume of fire. If the squad wanted to, it could of course use the BAR as a suppression weapon and maneuver about it. But the BAR was never really intended to operate separately from the remaining members of the squad and never intended as a general purpose weapon. At platoon, company, and battalion level, other machine guns, the Browning air-cooled, the Browning water-cooled, and the Browning 50 caliber heavy barrel were present in order to fill the suppression role or the base of fire role. When the American squad did maneuver against the enemy under the covering fire of platoon or company level machine guns, then the squad's semi-automatic Garand rifles and the BAR gave them a great advantage over a German squad. Not only was the squad's volume of fire much higher, but if the maneuvering squad was caught in a position where they needed long-range automatic fire, they still had a weapon that could get the job done. Each weapon, the BAR and the MG-34, had its own very unique set of characteristics, advantages, and disadvantages. Each weapon, when woven into the tactical organization and when coupled with the fire of other weapons, contributed to the success of their respective armies. Which is better? Neither. The intelligent leader used these weapons in concert with his other weapons in order to make an unbeatable team. The design trade-offs which you saw here are not unlike the design trade-offs in weapons which you use today. The basic concepts for the use of these weapons have not changed. The German soldier properly employed his MG-34 during World War II, and the American properly employed his BAR. We expect the same of you today. When a cartridge weapon is discharged, a number of forces are generated and a great deal of energy is released. The idea of using these forces or the energy in order to cycle the weapon surfaced in the 1880s. Though many people worked on putting this idea to use, such as McLean, Lewis, and Hotchkiss, I would like to concentrate on two major contributors whose designs made a mark on the course of warfare. These are Hiram Maxim and John Browning. Maxim harnessed the recoil forces generated upon discharge in order to cycle the weapon. By the 1880s, he had some practical designs. Though they worked reasonably well, his automatic weapons became what we understand to be a machine gun only after the introduction of smokeless powder and jacketed bullets. You have seen these developments in a previous tape. By 1893, Maxim was selling perfectly functional machine guns. Among their first recorded uses was action in the Matabele War of that same year. The painting Brave Men depicts the death of Alan Wilson's Shangani Patrol. The patrol was an advance element of Forbes's mobile column. After the Nabili had annihilated Wilson, their 7,000-man army advanced on Forbes, who credited his salvation to the Maxim machine gun. Maxim worked at refining his designs, and by 1908, the Maxim machine gun had been adopted by Germany and was made under license there. The same weapon was adopted and manufactured in England, where it was known as the Vickers. John Moses Browning had been working on another method of cycling an automatic weapon using the very same gases which propelled the projectile. His first workable designs were made by Colt Marlin and used in the Spanish-American War. When the bullet passed a hole or gas port located underneath the barrel, gas escaped and pressed on a lever. The lever rode all the way back and then was pushed forward by a spring, thereby completely cycling the weapon. For obvious reasons, this gun was nicknamed the Potato Digger. As war clouds loomed, Browning quickly branched aside and designed a machine gun using Maxim's short recoil idea, since short recoil was a good bit more compatible with water cooling. Without getting into French or Austrian variations, you can safely assume that every major combatant in World War I entered the war with a machine gun. The capabilities of all of them were quite similar. I will use this Browning 1917 water-cooled as a good example. Most of these weapons fed from a belt. As the belt was pulled through the machine gun by these feed pawls, individual rounds were pulled back out of the belt and then positioned on the bolt so that they would be next in line for chambering and firing. The Browning and the Maxim worked on the short recoil principle. In this method, the barrel, bolt, and barrel extension remain locked together after discharge and travel a short distance to the rear. After the bullet exits the barrel, the bolt then unlocks, sliding independently to the rear. The bolt comes back far enough so that the old cartridge case is extracted and ejected, and a new cartridge is placed in position. The bolt then travels forward, chambering the cartridge, and fires again as long as the trigger is held down. The Maxim, Browning, and many others were water-cooled. The barrel was surrounded by a water jacket holding approximately 5 quarts of water. After 600 rounds of continuous fire, the water would be brought to a boil and steam would exit through a steam bleed-over valve down through this hose into a condenser bucket. The second assistant gunner kept refilling the jacket as water would boil away at the rate of 1 quart for every 250 rounds. Though the water did boil away, it was recovered in the condenser bucket. It also stabilized the operating temperature of the weapon and allowed continuous, sustained fire. All of these weapons were extremely accurate and fired their rounds into a very small group, which, in machine gun terminology, is called the beaten zone. As an assist, they were equipped with a micrometer traversing and elevating mechanism so as to enhance their long-range accuracy. They also were chambered for the full-powered rifle cartridges of the nations involved, such as the 30-06 or 8mm Mauser. Let's see what this Browning can do. In its first target run, you'll see a silhouette target on top of a 4x4 fence post and two real sly buggers hiding behind a cinder block wall. That's pretty impressive. The Browning fired such a small group that it had no problem cutting down the 4x4 post in short order. Both the wall and the two guys hiding behind it took a severe drubbing. This latter target illustrates a point. A wall, unless it is solid masonry, is no real protection against small arms fire from full-powered rifle cartridges. Next, we'll engage a group of targets in the open using the traversing and elevating mechanism and a final assault of targets on line. See if you can spot some advantages and disadvantages of the water-cooled. The advantages of the water-cooled machine gun are quite obvious. It is extremely accurate, can fire at very long ranges, and has a very high sustained volume of fire. In fact, the water-cooled machine gun is unique among machine guns in that its sustained volume of fire is just about the same as its cyclic rate. The Maxim and the Browning both had usable volumes of fire on the order of 500 rounds per minute, and both had combat ranges well in excess of 2,000 yards. The water-cooled machine gun truly was the next best thing to being there. This tremendous capability is not free. For starters, the weapons are expensive to manufacture. You can see all of the very small yet very finely machined parts in this Maxim. Though the Browning was a good bit simpler, both weapons required major industrial investment. The crews for the weapons had to be large and highly trained. Highly trained because of the requirement for maintenance before and during firing, such as headspace, and spring tension adjustments. The crew had to be large because there were many other jobs to be done. Also, the water-cooled machine gun weighed well over 100 pounds, not counting water and ammunition. When broken down, it took at least 3 men to carry it. It also took a long period of time, 3 minutes or so, in order to get the weapon properly placed in position. You should have noted that we had 11 sandbags stacked on the Browning when we fired it. The extra weight of the sandbags helped damp out the vibrations of recoil and was a requirement if one was to take advantage of both the accuracy and the high sustained volume of fire. This does not tell the full story. Someone had to load the cloth belts with ammunition. This required a separate machine, such as this Browning cloth belt loader. The cloth belts had to be saved by one of the crew members. They were washed, dried, and then protected from mildew. They could not be loaded too far in advance, or the cloth would stretch and the cartridges would fall out. The advantage to the cloth belt is that it is much easier on the machine gun and does contribute to the overall reliability. The small beaten zone of the water-cooled machine gun translates to an extremely long adjust sight range. It was the job of the gunner to adjust sights for range and to compensate for wind drift. However, the gunner could normally not properly spot the fall of his rounds. Another individual with binoculars spotted the fall of the rounds. The vertical portions of the reticle on the binoculars that you use today are leftovers from that era. They are based on a logarithmic scale and were used for adjusting the fall of long-range machine gun fire on the ground. For the really long ranges, something over 15 or 1,600 yards, plus for indirect machine gun fire, that is, placing bullets down into a trench or into dead space behind a hill, even more equipment was required. Every crew carried a clinometer, which was used for adjusting the elevation of the machine gun in mills as specified in the firing tables. The effect of the water-cooled machine gun is common knowledge. The trench warfare of World War I can be attributed to the water-cooled machine gun along with the bolt-action magazine rifle and the new breed of artillery. Between these three, no man's land really was a place where no man could survive. As the British learned when they marched forward up the Somme, long-range machine gun fire was a force to be reckoned with and could inflict a horrendous number of casualties in a very short period of time. We need not go further into World War I, for you'll study that in much greater detail. When you do, remember what you have just seen about the water-cooled machine gun. How would you like to charge across no man's land through the barbed wire in the face of a water-cooled machine gun? You have all studied the deadlock of trench warfare in World War I. You have also learned that there are three major categories of solutions to the deadlock: the technical, tactical, and strategic. I would like to focus on one problem and then talk about one technical solution to it. The problem at hand is the problem of trench assault. After you have managed to survive your trip across no man's land and you get near an enemy trench, how do you rid that trench of all the antisocial people who are in it? By the time you get to the enemy's trench, he may well outnumber you, and you and he are both armed with bolt-action magazine rifles and the bayonet. Cleaning out a trench with a bayonet, though it can certainly be successful, is a relatively high-risk operation that consumes a great deal of manpower. Many armies experimented with new weapons which might help their soldiers do this job. In order to illustrate this point, we have prepared a target array which will give you some idea of what a soldier jumping into an enemy trench might have had to confront. The target array will consist of 3 stationary silhouette targets to the left, 3 more stationary silhouette targets to the right, and, after those are engaged, a surprise pop-up silhouette target that would roughly approximate an enemy soldier running out of a bunker or communications trench. As we engage this target array with various weapons, you should look at the advantages and disadvantages of each weapon going through the same target run. The first weapon will be the bolt-action rifle with the bayonet. The obvious problem with the bolt-action rifle is the long period of time between shots. The relatively small magazine capacity when you are dealing with an abundance of targets, and the requirement to go in with the bayonet. One of the American solutions was the riot or trench shotgun. This Model 97 trench shotgun is a good example of many of the weapons that were tried. Though it has a bayonet lug, it normally was not used with the bayonet. It fires a 12-gauge shotgun shell, which is loaded with buckshot. Depending on the size of the buckshot, it may hold anywhere from 9 to 24 pellets per shell. The weapon was a pump action, which means it was cycled by pulling the slide back and then pushing it forward. This motion extracted and ejected the empty cartridge in the chamber, fed a new round up from the magazine, locked it into the chamber, and cocked the weapon. The shooter then only had to pull the trigger. Due to the shortage of spare parts for this 1897 riot gun, a new Model 500 riot gun will be used. The shells each hold 13 number 0 buckshot. One of the major problems with the shotgun is quite obvious. Its tubular magazine holds only 6 rounds, and in order to reload it, the rounds must be individually inserted by the shooter. There is no magazine charging. When out of ammunition, it takes a long time to reload, and the shooter is vulnerable. The weapon appears to be very, very fast. The shooter killed his 6 stationary targets in well under 3 seconds. However, that can normally not be done in the hands of the ill-trained soldier. It took constant, repetitive training in order to achieve that sort of speed with a shotgun. Further, contrary to popular belief, you do not simply point a shotgun at the mass of the enemy and let fly. You select individual targets, aim at them, and kill them. The purpose of the buckshot is to give some margin for error. The pattern need not be perfectly centered on the chest. Secondly, buckshot kills by the sum total of the multiple wounds. The shooter using this shotgun has been using pump-action shotguns for 24 years, to include using them in both competition and combat. The average fellow with a shotgun would probably not acquit himself that well. Lastly, the remaining grave defect of the shotgun was not evident. The shotgun's maximum range with buckshot is only 50 yards. Though this is adequate for cleaning out a trench or for use at night, it leaves the shotgun-armed soldier at a desperate disadvantage when he is caught in the open during daylight. The Germans tackled the technical problem from a completely new angle. They created a new class of weapons with a new set of advantages and disadvantages. In order to gain long combat range with good terminal effect, a strong weapon, the bolt action, firing a powerful cartridge, was needed. The Germans decided to sacrifice long combat range. They took a pistol cartridge, the 9mm Luger, with vastly decreased range and energy, and chambered this into a shoulder-fired weapon. With the much reduced power of the ammunition, that shoulder-fired weapon could now be made fully automatic, and yet the soldier could still easily withstand the recoil and control the weapon. The result was the MP-18 submachine gun. You can see that the shooter of the submachine gun tackled his targets in only 5 seconds and still had ammunition for an 8th surprise target. He then easily reloaded his submachine gun with another magazine. You'll also note that the shooter engaged his targets with the proper short burst technique. He aimed at each individual target, gave it a burst, and then moved to the next. The submachine gun kills by firing a group on the target, much like the shotgun fires a pattern of buckshot. This group gives the shooter some margin for error and still assures adequate target hits. Contrary to what Hollywood would have you believe, the continuous spray is simply not effective with any weapon short of a water-cooled machine gun. As an example here, let us suppose that our submachine gun shooter was faced with 6 targets at double arm interval. This would give him a linear target width of 30 feet. He only has 32 rounds in the magazine, so he would have to have his sweeping motion perfectly in tune with the cyclic rate of fire of the weapon, and I suppose with the Zen harmony of the universe, in order to evenly space his bullets along that linear target. Hopefully, the spacing and the harmony would be such that a bullet would land on the breastbone of each of the 6 targets. Give me a break. The submachine gun is also important as an example of a design trade-off. It was a conscious attempt by the designers to satisfy a problem with a weapon that gives up advantage in one of the components of firepower in order to gain advantage in another component. On the chart, it looks something like this. Note the bolt action, which you have seen before, is our baseline weapon with a volume of fire of 14 rounds per minute and battle sight and adjust sight range going out to 1,000 yards. Remember that at close range, where the requirement for sight picture is somewhat less, the bolt action volume of fire could go up to 20 rounds per minute. The shotgun, which looks so good in that film clip, all of a sudden doesn't look so good here. Its range is only 50 yards, and its volume of fire is actually quite low. The problem here is the reloading of the magazine. Though it is lightning fast while ammunition is in the weapon, once it is emptied, it then becomes deathly slow. The submachine gun seems to be a good blend. Its maximum range, though short, at least does not leave the shooter totally naked and helpless. As long as his movement is covered by bolt-action magazine rifles and machine guns, he can still move across open ground and protect himself at some reasonable range before he gets to the enemy trench. At the close range, his high volume of fire, which is all controllable fire, then becomes the overriding factor. I'd like to emphasize again that it is controllable fire. The submachine gun fires a pistol cartridge in a heavy shoulder-fired weapon, and the bursts can be directed without problem from the recoil. If the weapon was chambered for a more powerful cartridge, the recoil would drive the weapon up and away from the target and would limit its usefulness severely. The submachine gun became an essential element in the total German combined solution that we now know as German Storm or German infiltration assault tactics. You'll study the results of the offensives using these tactics when you study World War I. Remember that the submachine gun, backed up with rifles and a new quasi-portable water-cooled machine gun, were the backbone of these tactics. The German platoon was organized around these weapons. One squad had submachine guns, with each submachine gunner having an ammunition bearer. Two squads had Mauser bolt-action rifles, and one squad had the 08-15 Maxim machine gun. None of these weapons could have survived alone. However, when woven into the proper organization and with a tactical doctrine that intelligently took advantage of each weapon's characteristics, they performed well.
Say, what is this? A gag? No, it's no gag. It's as serious as death. It doesn't matter what this civilian does with his time. If he wants to toss a ping pong ball down a bowling alley, it's his business. But in your business, brother, it matters. You just don't use a .45 caliber pistol cartridge like this if you've got a tough job for a walloper like the 105 millimeter howitzer shell. Don't get the wrong idea. They're both good. But they have different jobs to do. Between them lies the whole range of infantry ammunition and all the destruction and death it can produce. These are your tools from now on, soldier. Take a good look at them.
.30 caliber carbine. .30 caliber rifle and machine gun. .50 caliber machine gun. Hand grenade. Rifle grenade, fragmentation. Anti-tank rifle grenade. Anti-tank rocket. 60 millimeter mortar, fragmentation. 81 millimeter mortar, fragmentation. 81 millimeter mortar, demolition. 37 millimeter armor piercing. 57 millimeter armor piercing.
Let's look at them one by one and see what you've got on your side. The smallest weapon in the infantry regiment, a .45 caliber automatic pistol. It's a quick-handling, rapid-fire weapon with a real wallop. Beyond 50 yards, it won't penetrate armor, even light armor like this steel helmet. But the heavy slug has terrific shot power. It'll knock a man down almost any time it hits him. You can use it in a tough spot at close range. But the real bite of the infantry is .30 caliber ammunition. This is the stuff you're going to have to live with. You'll use both types, .30 caliber rifle and .30 caliber carbine. Take a look at the carbine first. It has replaced many pistols in the infantry regiment. It's most effective at short ranges, where you can fire 40 aimed shots a minute. At a range of 100 yards, this is what the carbine can do to a Nazi. He'd need more than aspirin for that head. Those monkeys aren't all behind trees. Take your time. A lot of these guys are going to be dead if you take your time. Squeeze them off, make it good. Pretty handy, that carbine. Even though it weighs only 5 pounds, it's a killer if you know just when to use it. Don't try to knock out a tank with it. But if a truck like this comes along, 5 pounds of carbine can be more effective than a 5-ton roadblock. That's what a carbine with light .30 caliber ammunition can do up to 300 yards. But now take a gander at your heavier .30 caliber stuff. The stuff you riflemen have stashed away in your belts. That's really something. It comes in 3 kinds: armor piercing, tracer, and ball. And soldier, it's going to be your best friend day in and day out. Whether you fire it with the M1, the 03, the M1917, the BAR, or a machine gun, the penetrating force is the same: murderous. Remember what the carbine did to this German helmet? It went through easy enough, but the rifle slug just blasts through steel as if it were brown paper. Yeah, and it can do a lot more than plow through a helmet. For instance, that looks like pretty solid cover, doesn't it? An oak tree 12 inches thick. Now watch that bucket. Through the tree, through the bucket. That would make a pretty dead Nazi. Maybe you never realized what that .30 caliber of yours can do. Maybe you forgot. Well, take a look at this concrete wall. It's 4 inches thick. On the range, you find out that your rifle is the most accurate in the world. Now you'll see that it's got a punch to match. Anyone using that wall for cover would do it just once. At ranges up to 200 yards, armor-piercing ammunition can smash through this kind of wall any time, any day. Brother, that .30 caliber stuff is your right arm. .30 caliber ammunition doesn't look like much of a match for this brute, does it? Well, it isn't. But you can always use your head, too. That German 75 isn't worth a damn without a crew. Sure, the gun's still there, but so is your rifle. Plug the recoil mechanism. Or smack him in the eye, knock his sights out. That's a pretty sight. A blind German gun. You can put the clincher on it, knock it out for keeps with an incendiary grenade. Jam one of those incendiary grenades down the bore of the gun, and the metal from the grenade will fuse with the tube. That chokes it up fine, for good. Plenty of nothing. The incendiary grenade was just what the doctor recommended for the German 75. But you've got another prescription for the boys themselves. The fragmentation grenade. It's very useful for treating them when they're bunched, like these guys. Flying fragments will give them a long rest cure. You've got different grenades for almost any situation. Suppose you're in a spot and want to advance behind a smoke screen. Well, reach into your bag for a white phosphorus hand grenade. It throws burning particles as far as 20 feet. It's not meant to be an offensive weapon, but a hot shower like this is nothing to get caught in. A few drops on his skin will make him wish he were dead. If enough fall on him, he will be. What if you find a Nazi pillbox staring you in the face and you want to take care of it without being seen? There's one more GI grenade. The Army calls it the frangible grenade with the FS filler. But if that sounds like double talk to you, just remember this. It produces a heavier smoke screen than the white phosphorus hand grenade. It hangs around a lot longer. It'll cover the movement of more men and help them get up there to smash that pillbox. Now for your automatic weapons. Lesson number 1. These 5 men with M1s are getting off a total of 80 aimed shots a minute. This man coming up with the automatic rifle, the BAR to you, can also fire 80 shots a minute, himself. That'll give you some idea of the destructive power of your automatic weapons. It means, of course, that one man with the BAR has a firepower equal to 5 men with the M1 and can pin the enemy down just as effectively. The 5 riflemen are now free to maneuver. They can come around and try to hit him on the flank. A powerful weapon in the hands of a well-trained man. The BAR, 80 shots a minute. But a machine gun is more powerful than a BAR. Nothing but the best for the master race. And this is a machine gunner's dream. He can mow them down like wheat at 250 rounds a minute. That's still the same .30 caliber you've got socked away in your cartridge belt. Coming out of your M1, it's deadly, sure. But when it's pouring out of a machine gun, light or heavy, it can make a man look like a sieve in a matter of seconds. Machine guns can tackle all kinds of targets. For example, it's got plenty of pepper for a dish like this. That doesn't have to be a treat. Your machine gun can do a lot more to something that's breathing. And this won't be a wall much longer. But the main job of the heavy machine gun is to cover an area with bullets. 2 or more guns can make a peaceful pond look like this. Principally because of vibrations, the bullets of a single gun make this long pattern. This is the beaten zone, made at 1,000 yards. The enemy, 1,000 yards away. Long range for some weapons, but not for the stuff these boys are packing. It's just what this machine gun's looking for. Ever hear a battle between 2 machine guns? They talk back and forth for a while, then all of a sudden, one of them runs out of dialogue. Our machine gun has a good position. It's protected from flat trajectory fire. But the enemy has mortars, and mortar fire is high-angle fire which can slam down from the sky. There's only one thing to do in a case like this. Get ready to move to another position. Meanwhile, we have mortars too. 2 kinds. This 81 millimeter, whose shell has an effective radius of 25 yards, and the 60 millimeter, whose shell has an effective radius of 17 yards. Our mortars can take care of the enemy's machine guns. And with the high angle of fire, they're mortars as well. Of course, an exploding mortar shell can kill. But let's see just how convincing it can be. The overhead cover for this command post is 2 feet thick, made of dirt and logs, and a swell target for the 81 millimeter heavy high explosive shell. The shell weighs 10 3/4 pounds, and it's equipped with a delay action fuse which explodes after penetration. The mortar also fires smoke shell. The white phosphorus may set fire to very dry materials, and it will produce casualties. But its main job is to blind the enemy with a heavy white smoke. Here come the big boys, the sluggers. Tough? Sure. Powerful armor, heavy firepower, very tough. But they can be taken. You've got the weapons to blind him. Burn his pants off, blow him to hell. Watch. An ordinary bottle. Fill it with fire and you've got a Molotov cocktail. These cocktails can be homemade from gasoline, crankcase drainage, and saturated rags. Light the stuff with a match. 3 alarms for any tank in the business. If you have one of these M1 frangible grenades equipped with an igniter, you can forget the homemade cocktail. But whichever you use, the Molotov cocktail's no party for guys in a tank. You may not always have a cocktail, but you will have a rifle. It won't rip the tracks off a tank or puncture the armor, but a rifle can make it button up. You can jab his eyes out. Blind a tank and it's practically out of business. But you don't have to gamble on hitting a target as small as a slit if you've got an anti-tank grenade. This is the most powerful weapon you carry. It makes you a walking arsenal. It weighs 1 1/4 pounds, and it'll do a go-to-hell job on any light or medium tank. Doesn't look like much, does it? But don't kid yourself. The steel that came from that hole was shattered into fragments that whizzed inside the tank like a gang of hornets. You can put that kind of a hole in a tank from 75 yards. But remember, whenever you can, hold your fire. Wait till the tank is smack up on you. Now, give it to him. Hit him square where the armor is thinnest, on the rear or side. Don't let the words anti-tank throw you. Watch what it can do to an enemy machine gun packed with plenty of sandbagging. See? It doesn't have to be a tank for the anti-tank grenade to go to work. But the anti-tank grenade is not the only one you can fire off the end of your rifle. For example, you can't lob a grenade by hand at these Nazis. They're too far away. But you've got fragmentation grenades. And if you launch them with either your rifle or carbine, it's like sending your Sunday punch airmail. There are two kinds of fragmentation grenades. This one is time-fused. You fire it when you want an air burst above the ground. The other one has an impact fuse, like the anti-tank grenade. It explodes as soon as it hits hard enough ground. Both fragmentation grenades carry about 200 yards and have about the same effect. If any of those supermen are within 5 yards of either burst, finished. There's another weapon in the infantry regiment. When it first came out, soldiers thought it must have been found in a pile of junk. This is far from the truth. The first time the Nazis got a peek at it, they termed it a secret weapon because they didn't know what hit them. It's called a bazooka. It has knockout written all over it. Like everything else in the Army, it's got an official name, the Anti-Tank Rocket Launcher, and it'll tackle almost any kind of target. It can stop a tank all by itself. Stop it cold. A few on a railroad, and the enemy goes back to mules. A sandbag emplacement is no place for the enemy to hide. Not when he's hiding from the bazooka. Don't think this pillbox is heaven. The bazooka makes it hell. But the bazooka has one special dish, a light or medium tank. It'll knock a hole through the sides of a tank all day, from any range up to 200 yards. Okay, you've seen a rifle smash a vision slit. You know how the anti-tank grenade and the bazooka can plow through armor. Now let's see how the 37mm anti-tank gun earns its keep. Against troop carriers and crew-served weapons, it's effective to about 1,000 yards with high explosive shell. The armor-piercing shell will do the job against tanks to about 400 yards. And against half-tracks and armored cars at ranges up to 1,000 yards.
On wheels, hot!
It has a high rate of fire, 30 shots a minute. That means a steady stream of hot steel.
Hot! Front! Tank! 400! Zero lead! Ahead! Fire!
And because of its flat trajectory, it's a real sharpshooter. It can hit a tank square on the button. It won't penetrate a medium tank's front armor, only dent it. But just let the tank turn its side. The 37 doesn't kid against the side.
Left front! Pillbox!
A tank isn't the only target the 37 can smash. At 800 yards, it can pierce nearly 2 feet of concrete.
800! Come in! Fire! Hit! Hit!
37 cuts them down to size. In this case, the projectile penetrated 21 inches. But the 57 millimeter is an even tougher anti-tank gun. It takes over where the 37 leaves off. And at 800 yards or less, it's deadly. Like the 37, the flat trajectory gives it bullseye accuracy.
Front, right, 400, 0 lead, up, ahead, turn, fire!
It can smash a hole like this through any part of a tank, front, sides, or rear.
Good direction left,
It goes for concrete emplacements, too.
front, pillbox, 800, ahead, fire! Hit! Hit! Cease firing!
Call in the salvage company. Some people say this is an air war. Maybe so. But don't sell short on the infantry. Even if you feel like burying your head, don't. That won't bring him down. When you're ordered to, your job is to try to get him. A plane flying low over troops has often been knocked down by small arms fire. Of course, the infantry doesn't have to rely entirely on its rifles against planes. It has 4 other highly effective anti-aircraft weapons. The BAR, the light machine gun, the heavy machine gun, and most vicious of all, the 50 caliber machine gun. This is the baby flying fortresses protect themselves with. The Nazis hate it, and the 50 has been known to make Jap strafers pretty shy. Don't forget, a plane's got a lot of vulnerable spots, like the engines or the pilot. So keep that lead hot. Keep it ripping into the sky. Even though you don't knock them clear out and down, you can still wound them, chase them off, make them go flapping and limping home to lay up for repairs. That's your job. Hit them with everything you've got. Here's the infantry regiment's largest and most powerful weapon, the 105 millimeter howitzer. It's the infantry's bulldog. It goes for targets too tough for any of its other weapons. Enemy cannon, anti-tank guns, concrete emplacements, roadblocks. Its effective range is nearly 3 miles, and it's light and easy to handle.
Roadblock gauge, range 800, fire well.
Watch it against this stubborn baby. A roadblock, 4 feet thick.
Fire!
This is the result of only 5 shots. To blow it off the face of the earth would probably take 15. It's a real slugger in street fighting, too, when you have to run the enemy out of a building constructed of solid stuff like this. Here are the 2 whoppers the howitzer pounds out. Assassins, both of them. The high explosive shell for jobs like the roadblock, and the high explosive anti-tank shell for jobs like this. He won't get very far. Not with that kind of ventilation. Soldier, maybe you're from Minnesota. Maybe you're from Mississippi, New York, or New Mexico. It doesn't matter from where. You all want peace again. And here are the peacemakers. They're tops. Everything you've seen in this picture and more. But a weapon is only as good as the man behind it. So give 'em hell. And someday you'll be marching in the streets, bringing the peace all Americans